Happy Wednesday, everybody. Welcome once again to another fabulous edition of Chamber Chat, presented by Bose McKinney & Evans, LLP. My name is Brad Kloppenstein. I am president of the Greater Lawrence Chamber of Commerce. This is our semi-regular feature of interesting people in the community. Today, we have someone very interesting. Joining us from the Indiana Manufacturers Association, we have President and CEO Brian Burton, one of the finest golfers I know, one of the finest human beings, and he is willing to share his time with us in Lawrence. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Brad. I used to be a fine golfer and I used to be a fine individual. So,
well, then COVID hit and you became better at both. So thank you for joining us. So let's talk a little bit. One, congratulations on being featured right here in the December 10th issue of Indiana Business Journal.
that's news to me. I did not know that.
You did not know that?
Oh.
Did you know you were quoted, or do you have people?
Oh no, I'm sorry. Yes, I am quoted.
Okay.
I know it's
So in that article, you were talking about House Bill 1001. Let's talk a little bit about that and where manufacturing stands on mandatory vaccinations.
Yeah. Before I get to that, let me just start out a little bit about, I want everyone to know that Indiana's a manufacturing state. We have the highest percentage of employment, highest percentage of GDP in manufacturing. We make things here. Our longtime motto is what Indiana makes Indiana. That's truer today than it ever has been. So it's very important that we keep an eye on the manufacturing sector because it's really the engine that drives Indiana's economy. And we've been through a lot. Go back to the end of the 20 session, March 11th in 2020. We were finishing up a short session. It was midnight. Everybody was congratulating themselves on a fine session. The legislators ended about 2 days early because they had the NCAA regional basketball coming to town and they were going to lose their hotel rooms. So I will tell you that we have learned how to get legislators out of town. We just schedule an NCAA event and so they lose their hotel rooms. So the next day on the 12th, things started just really starting to crumble around everyone. News of lockdowns started occurring. On December 13th, I assembled our staff and said, listen, we're going to work remotely for the first time. Probably see you in about a week. That didn't come to pass. So it's been a lot. But Indiana's manufacturing has continued to keep going and growing, creating jobs. We were very vocal about making sure that manufacturing was deemed essential during all of this because it is. And, if you want to go to the store and get groceries or pick up needed supplies or whatever, everything is manufactured. So we have to keep that in mind. So then we come into last session, which was very unique. I don't think any of us that have been around the State House for a while, that was my 32nd session, had ever seen anything like that with remote testimony and everybody trying to do things differently. I will tell you, then we ended up finishing up this session on November 15th of 2021, that 21 session, which is by far, I think, the longest session in Indiana history because it came in at Organization Day on March 19th of 2020 when the session actually ended, and then did not adjourn until November of 2021, November 15th. So all told, if you add that up, the length of the session was 361 days or 11 months and 26 days long. Probably the longest session, technically the longest session in Indiana history. So we have done just about everything we can to try to make our workplaces safe. Keep in mind that most manufacturing are closed facilities. We don't have a whole lot of public to come into those. So therefore, it was easier for manufacturers to keep going. We developed personal protective equipment. We put together all kinds of information on how to comply with the myriad of programs that were coming down. Now, as we come through this, there is, of course, President Biden's emergency temporary standard through OSHA that is now back on track as of Friday. So that comes into effect, I think, the first part of November for employers. They moved the date back about 5 weeks for compliance. And then the Indiana House Republicans decided to introduce House Bill 1001. And 1001, it's a statement. That's the number one bill. So, and it has came back. They had one hearing in his joint rules between House and Senate that lasted 7 hours, and probably one of the most remarkable hearings that I have ever seen. Then they decided to replay it and redo it again last Thursday, where the House Labor Committee has 7 hours of testimony on the same bill with the same people testifying and basically making the same arguments. No vote, and they're going to come back in and try to expedite a bill coming up. The problem with this bill is that it does conflict with the federal temporary emergency standard. It does have more requirement, another additional requirement, whereas it says that if an employer has a mandatory vaccination program, then they must provide exemptions for medical and religious, understand that. But also it requires weekly testing, of which the Indiana version, Indiana House Republican version, House Bill 1001, says that the testing shall be provided to the employee at no cost to the employee, which flies in the face and contradicts what President Biden's requirement is, which does not require the employer to pay for those tests. That could be very, very expensive, and it's impractical. You don't have enough tests in this country. More and more news reports are coming out that tests are very difficult to get, whether it's the swab test or the more expensive PCR tests. So it's impractical. It's going to be hugely expensive. One employer estimated that the first year of paying for those tests for their 350 that are unvaccinated would be about $1.2 million. So it's very, very expensive and burdensome. So it's a concern. We think it's fast-tracked. We hope that the Senate would take a more reasoned approach to this and realize the implications for this. To have Indiana doing something that is more burdensome than what President Biden was planning on doing is kind of remarkable. And we find that just remarkable. So that's where we are on the vaccines. And here's the whole time. The state of Indiana has spent millions and millions of dollars in promoting people to go out and get vaccinated. But Indiana still has one of the lowest vaccination rates. Only about half of our population has received their full set of shots or are vaccinated. So we have one of the lowest vaccination rates, even though we continually try to push those to get involved with the program so we can kind of beat this down. You got the Omicron variant that is now rearing its head, and you're starting to see places locked down, events being terminated and canceled. So we hope we don't go back into the situation we were in.
We're talking to Brian Burton, head of the Indiana Manufacturers Association. So Brian, let me ask, are you surprised that this bill is 1001, that this is the highest priority for the House in this session?
Well, given all the other issues that the legislature could address, this was, I think it was, they're trying to make a statement, but sometimes statement bills have unintended consequences. And this may be the case here. I certainly understand personal freedom, and if you don't want to get a vaccine, there is an out for you, which is an exemption, and so that's in the bill. But there are certain reasons why some employers, not all, most of our members do not require as a condition of employment the vaccination. Most of our members do not. And they have done everything they can, including monetary incentives and others, to get people to voluntarily get vaccinated. But every facility is not the same. And I think the federal courts ruled, whenever they stayed the order, initially said that a medical facility is different than a single truck driver in a truck. That the exposure is completely different. And to have one standard fit all is very problematic.
So do you think that this kind of is at odds with Indiana being an at-will employment state?
Well, you still have at-will employment. And remember, at-will employment works both ways, right?
Right.
That you can employ somebody or not employ somebody, and somebody can work for you or not work for you. So that's freedom. So if you don't like the working conditions, you certainly have the ability to go someplace else. And I will tell you, particularly in today's workforce environment, employers are doing everything to attract workers to work there and to show up on and continue to work. Incentive programs, modification of hours, a variety of different things. We are still facing a huge worker shortage in this state. Now, also part of the House bill, which it was discussed, but the language has not been seen yet. The House Republicans are looking at doing those that quit their job because of vaccine requirements, that they would be eligible for unemployment benefits. The unemployment system was never designed for that. It is an insurance system, and there is no underwriting to cover that expense. So that's not what it's designed for. So we hope that is not included in the bill, but we hear that it is going to.
So let me ask you, how are your members holding up? I mean, obviously we're now 20 months into COVID. You know, we hear about product shortages, supply chain issues. Is it a worker shortage that is a problem? Is it raw materials that's a problem? Is it all a problem? Or are we doing fairly well given all things considered?
It's actually all a problem, but we're doing fairly well. The problem, there are two major issues, which is workforce and supply chain. The supply chain is solvable. I don't think the workforce issue is solvable. We have a population problem. 40% of our workforce is going to be retiring in the next 10 years, so we don't have that population base to come back up. Now, give rise to the importance of business personal property taxes, which is also a discussion that's going to happen this next session, is that we have to invest in technology. And let me explain it this way. I was down with one of our members in Batesville, Indiana, and they have 50 skilled positions that they just cannot fill. They're constantly open and they cannot fill them, even though wages have increased and everything else they've tried. They said, we are looking at technology to fill that gap. We're not trying to eliminate positions because they're not filled now, but we're going to use technology to backfill those open positions. So that's what you're going to see is a lot of investment in technology trying to backfill the skilled labor that is not there. So it's that supply chain. We've all heard the stories. We've all seen the pictures. We all get the reports of the tankers off the coast waiting to be unloaded. That is also a workforce issue because they don't have the workforce to do that. That will work its way out. The chip shortage will eventually work its way out. Supply chains will get caught up. We're still going to have quite a bit of pain for the next year. I was at the grocery over the weekend and I was surprised to see, it's probably because it's before a holiday, the empty space on a lot of the shelves. It's something that you normally don't see, but that will work itself out. The workforce issue is much more difficult.
You are watching the Greater Lawrence Chamber of Commerce Chamber Chat presented by Bose McKinney & Evans, LLP. Thank you, Bose McKinney & Evans, for sponsoring this. We're talking to Brian Burton, president of the Indiana Manufacturers Association. Brian, thanks for joining us today. Let's open it up to our gallery and take some questions from those who are assembled. Do we have questions? I know Abdul does. Go right ahead, Abdul.
All right, good to talk to you, Brett. Brian, question for you. On the business personal property tax, talk about whether it should be repealed. I know for local governments, it probably costs about $173 million and change. We just had the revenue forecast out there, $5 billion by the end of 2023. Where is manufacturing on the repeal of the business personal property tax?
Well, we're one of a few states that have a business personal property tax, which is remarkable in the fact that there are 20 states that don't have tax any of the business personal property. And we're at 30% floor, which means you cannot go below that 30% floor on depreciation. So that is the highest in the country. So the most manufacturing intensive, equipment intensive state in the country, and we have one of the worst business personal property taxes. That's the what sticks out. You know, whenever they do the rankings, they go through all our tax structure and everything else. And generally, Indiana is ranked very high in the overall rankings. But this is really one of the black eyes that we have. That is something that sticks out, and I think really certainly does not help in economic development whenever we're competing with states that don't have something like this. Now, the argument at the State House right now is, okay, what's the replacement revenue? Okay, that's the discussion that is occurring. But I think there's a number of legislators that are wanting to examine this and see if there's something we can do on that. Not a complete elimination, but maybe a phase out or something along those lines. Still in discussion phase.
So Brian, let me ask you, healthcare. How does this all morph into healthcare and healthcare liability for the manufacturing sector?
Yeah, healthcare is one of our top priorities. Indiana ranks terribly in the cost of hospital pricing. We're one of the highest hospital prices in the country. Typically, we're between 20 and 25% above the national average in all of our hospital pricing. So it doesn't make any sense because Indiana is 9% below in cost of living, but 20 to 25% higher than the national average for hospital pricing. Example, the RAND study, there's been 3 different RAND studies, 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, and all of them came out that Indiana ranked very, very high. They're having another study that will be out to update those numbers here in the next few months. But compared to Michigan, the average procedure in a hospital in Indiana is twice as much as if you step across the state line into Michigan. It's half of what it is in Indiana. And the reason is, the question is why? Well, hospital margins are extremely high. In a period between 2016 and 2019, for example, IU Health, the largest in the state, had a average profit margin of 16.25%. And if you add up all of the cash and cash equivalents, not the hospital's foundations, not their foundations, but just the cash and cash equivalents that they have, you're looking at over, take Ascension out of this, okay? But the not-for-profit hospitals are sitting on over $13 billion in cash and cash equivalents. Now, keep in mind, the reserve for the state of Indiana is $2 billion, to put that in perspective. And then if you factor in Ascension, because they report by all states together, you're looking at Ascension itself, adding in over $31.5 billion in cash and cash equivalents. So it is a huge drain on our system, and employers have done everything they can to try to mitigate the effect on this, raising copays and deductibles, lowering different coverages and everything else. We've done everything we can. It's really affecting wage growth in Indiana. And so the money's got to come from somewhere. And so it's employers and employees are feeling the brunt of this.
All right. So how do we fix it?
Well, I think you have to put some kind of controls on what they can charge. Whether it be, say, a national, you cannot exceed a national average, or what is called site of service, making sure that where you have your procedure done, it's either a hospital or an off-hospital setting. Those prices is about 40% price differential, but their bill is the same. So if you go to an off-site facility, you're being billed as if you are at the hospital. So we need to make sure that the billing is correct. We need to have some sort of caps on what those reimbursement levels can be. We do that in the medical component for workers' compensation. We have 200% of Medicare. That's the cap for the medical. If it works in healthcare hospitals pricing for workers' comp, why not can't it work for general medical. So something has to be done. We cannot continue on this glide path because it will implode.
We're talking to Brian Burton, president of the Indiana Manufacturers Association. I'm Brad Kloffenstein, president of the Greater Lawrence Chamber of Commerce, and you are watching and listening to Chamber Chat, presented by Bose McKinney and Evans. Make sure they get their commercial in there. So Brian, back just on manufacturing and your members, and as it relates to the state of Indiana, what does Indiana do well that encourages manufacturing? What do we manufacture well, and what are our challenges to get better?
Well, what we do well is we've created an environment over many, many decades that nurtures manufacturing. So we have the infrastructure that is there. It's so much different than the call centers. The economic development used to have the call centers come in and they would plug in phones in temporary offices, but the problem is they can unplug those phones and go to some other state. Our investment is in concrete and rebar and heavy equipment, and it's a huge capital investment. So we need to make sure that we have still certainty and predictability in our business climate, our political climate, because these investments are just not for a year or two. These are decades-long investments. And so therefore we have to have the consistency in our political and economic system. What we do well is we make things, and we have great research universities here. We have the support systems, and we have other manufacturers that can talk to each other, talk about problems and solutions, and that type of thing. So what we don't do well is provide the training that we need to get in. Ivy Tech and Vincennes University do a fabulous job, but they're at capacity. And we need to make sure that whatever incentives that we have in the state of Indiana, we need to incentivize individuals to get into those skill upgrades that they need to make sure that they thrive in our economy. I will, over the last number of years, not a whole lot of years, there has been a move afoot of people talking about, hey, we have great four-year institutions, but not every kid needs to go to a four-year institution. So we have one of the highest percentage of high school grads going to a four-year institution. About 60% of our high school grads go to a four-year institution, but we lose half of those the first year because they're ill-prepared. And they come out with debt and disappointment and languish. However, many times they can get into shorter-term training programs, associate degrees and others, and come out and have a fantastic career in manufacturing. Let me give an example. In manufacturing last year, the average compensation was $79,000. Okay. The average compensation for all other sectors combined was about $48,000. So there's a premium pay there, and we're one of the largest payers of benefit or suppliers of benefits around. So that's very important that young kids coming out understand there's opportunities for them.
So obviously the last 25, 30 years, maybe longer than that, manufacturing just in the United States in general is kind of eroded. We've seen a lot of that offshores. The issues that we're having on just getting things in, do you think that that's going to result in more items being manufactured here in the United States and hopefully in Indiana?
Yeah, I think you're seeing more and more discussions on reshoring and making sure that supply chain is not affected by foreign entities. Whenever you put, let me give you an example. The average vehicle, we talk about a chip shortage. It's not one or two chips in a vehicle. The average vehicle today has over 300 chips in it. Okay, that's excluding the audio system. If you put the audio system in, it's much more. But 300 chips per vehicle. And if you have, the foresight should have seen if we have a chip shortage, what's going to happen to our supply chain. And manufacturers for years have used just-in-time manufacturing. It's an orchestrated dance that you have all those parts there. You go to an auto facility and they're spitting out cars or trucks. They may only have between 4 and 6 hours of parts on site. There's an orchestrated dance of rail and trucks coming in at specific times, so it's there when it's needed on the line. So it's a delicate balance, and it needs to be fine tuned.
So let me ask the gallery, any more questions from the gallery while we have Brian here with us?
Yeah, I have a question, Brian. This is David. I want to go back to the personal property tax. Like here in Hamilton County, I think we probably collect something like $38 million from property tax, personal property tax. I think the total property tax is around $600 million or something like that. I don't know. I heard you say, they're discussing replacing that in some way. What kind of ideas do they have in replacing that revenue that would be lost if we eliminated the personal property tax?
Yeah, David, there's a whole host of ideas that are out there. They have not really focused on any one. They are at the point of saying, okay, part B of the discussion has to be, do we replace, and how much do we replace, and where does it come from? So there's a whole host of ideas that are floating around at this point. And I don't have a direct answer for you because nothing has really bubbled to the top.
Yeah, I know one thing that we do here. I mean, what we did recently in the life sciences, we just abate it. You find most communities abating those right now. And, if we abated everyone that came along in the long run, eventually, they could just end it because we'd have already abated them,
Right. David, I'm somewhat familiar with Fishers. I moved there in 1984. At a point whenever I had to drive to Castleton to Cub Foods, that was the nearest grocery store. So somewhat familiar with the area.
So Brian, we're running out of time here. Other parting thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience, Lawrence in particular, on what you see in your crystal ball, what's coming up in the future, and what do you think some of our challenges are going to be?
Well, I think let's do two parts. One is legislative. We talked about many of those. There'll be dozens and dozens of other issues that are going to arise. We're going into a short session, which, in the early 70s, they decided to do an additional session between the two long sessions because there may be an emergency budgetary issue arise which needs to be addressed. Well, typically we'll have about 12 to 1,300 emergencies arrive during a short session. And so it's turned into a full-blown session, a little scarier than a long session because things move quicker and there's not as much time for analysis and debate. But keep an eye through Brad and others, keep an eye on what the General Assembly is doing, and please provide your feedback to legislators on how that directly affects you. The state of Indiana, we have to do what we have to do to get through another surge of COVID. You're starting to see, as I mentioned, some concerns about closures and lockdowns and cancellation of events. We can't go through what we went through before. I think we're in a much better position. I hope that we can knock this down quickly, that the estimates of millions of cases very quickly do not come to pass, but we all must do our own part to try to help knock this thing down and get our economy back and rolling. I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned that the backlash of trying to slow down an economy again, and is really that the right decision to make? I think people will be studying 2020 and 2021 for many decades to come in business schools and political science classes and others on what the effect was. So jump in, get involved, because it's really remarkable how much input one individual has in calling their legislator and just saying, listen, this is how it impacts me. It really does make a difference.
Well, it does. In fact, we have a state senator who's joining us today, and I think that he would tell you that if he hears of an issue once, it might be an outlier. If he hears of an issue twice from his constituents, there might be something to it if he hears from them 5 times. Suddenly that is a groundswell of support. So you're right. It's they don't get contacted nearly as much as you'd think, and I know that they appreciate hearing from their constituents.
I learned a lot back in the mid 90s. We had a huge issue arise, and I mounted a major lobbying effort and a grassroots effort to contact your legislators and everything else. And afterwards, I was talking to President Pro Tem of the Senate, and he said, "Brian, business community was pretty upset about that, weren't they? Really involved?" I said, "Yes, sir, they were." He said, "Well, I got a lot of communication on that." I said, "I bet you did, Senator." And I was expecting these, this is before the internet, but I was expecting these huge bags of mail stacked around his office. And I said, "Senator, just how many letters did you get on this?" He goes, "Oh, I bet I got 5 or 6. So just 1 or 2 pieces of communication has a huge impact.
Yes. Now, and you also mentioned that in 2020, if you want the legislature to adjourn, all they need to do is have some basketball games. My experience in 2021 is if they have a bunch of basketball games in Indianapolis when the legislature's in session, that just means my house becomes a crash pad.
Well, you need to get better locks on your door.
So thank you all for tuning in and watching. You've been watching the Greater Lawrence Chamber of Commerce Chamber Chat, presented by Bose, McKinney, and Evans. I'm Brad Klopfenstein, president of the Greater Lawrence Chamber. Our guest today has been Brian Burton from the Indiana Manufacturers Association. Thank you all for tuning in. Brian, thank you very much for joining us and giving us some of your time. You're a great golfing partner. And I think we are 2 or 3 times running Mike Young for Senate golf outing champions.
There you go.
So yes, thank you for your input on that. I think I can do it in one stroke.
And I also note that having won that twice, that and $6 will get you a latte at Starbucks.
Absolutely. So Abdul, thanks for being here. Andy, Bill, David, thank you all for joining us. And again, this will be posted to our Facebook page and YouTube channel here in about an hour or so. So everybody have a great afternoon.
Brian, thanks for continuing to advocate for manufacturing. Look forward to working with you.
Thank you,
Thank
Senator.
you, guys.
Take care,
Thank you.
guys.